So you've probably heard the news by now. Intermittent fasting is nothing special. Intermittent fasting accelerates muscle loss. Intermittent fasting doesn't lead to enhanced fat loss compared to calorie restriction. So what we're going to do today is talk about the details of this study and reveal some nuances that most of the media coverage has really not talked about. So I want to welcome you back. It's Mike Mutzel. Thank you for being here. If you like these science-based videos, please hit that like button, consider subscribing to our podcast, and also sharing this with a friend so that they can learn some scientific nuances and details and practical applications when it comes to metabolic health. So let's dive into it. The title of the study that we're going to unpack here is a randomized controlled trial to isolate the effects of fasting and energy restriction on weight loss and metabolic health in lean adults. This is important nuance, that latter two words that I just said, lean adults. Let's just pause here. When it comes to fasting for weight loss, no one is really recommending the fasting protocol that these study subjects were imparted on, alternate day fasting, really. So the media coverage on this is using the word intermittent fasting, but really this was an alternate day fasting study comparing alternate day fasting in an energy surplus on feed days compared to standard 25% calorie restriction. So this is a little, I think it's a big detail that's often omitted from the media coverage. Now, what's kind of cool here is a lot of scientific articles and journals now are listing the media coverage with regards to their papers. So this is right from the journal's website, Science Translational Medicine. What you can see here is a lot of different sensational headlines. Yahoo News, one surprising side effect of intermittent fasting, new study says, and they go on to talk about muscle loss with fasting and so forth. Remember, lean adults studied, basically they fasted, they did a complete 24-hour fast every other day. That is pretty extreme. If we just take a quick pause and talk about the subtypes of intermittent fasting, under that we have like 16-8, we have a 24 where the fasting window would be 20 hours, a meal window 4 hours. We have 1 meal a day or OMAD. We have TRF, which is time restricted feeding. And then sort of the most extreme version of intermittent fasting is alternate day feeding or alternate day fasting, ADF. Now, interestingly, that is not generally recommended, practically speaking, by anyone that I know for lean, healthy people. This is a more extreme version for people, a more extreme version of intermittent fasting, that is, for people who are overweight and have a lot of metabolic or cardiometabolic health issues. So that being said, what you're seeing here on the media coverage of this is one surprising side effect of intermittent fasting. And they talk about muscle loss and all of this. And interesting, it's not till you get down here. I think there was only one sort of honest headline, and that was alternate day fasting has no specific health or metabolic benefits over standard daily diet. Okay. So again, at least they're using the proper terminology and recognizing the sort of criteria of the study, and that the criteria and the study methodology was, which we're going to unpack here. I think it's important to understand that this was alternate day feeding, alternate day fasting. So, okay, essentially, this is clinicaltrials.gov. This was sponsored by University of Bath, and I actually reached out to this author in 2015, Ian Templeman, to get him on the podcast, and he said, you know what, let's wait till after the study, because the impetus to conduct this study was, and it was a good critique, and the reason why they did this is many of these so-called fasting studies allow individuals to consume energy on fasting days when they should be really fasting, which to me, that didn't make a lot of sense. So they were trying to disentangle the health benefits of fasting. Is it attributed to the energy deficit that's created during fasting, or is it attributed to some hormonal shift or epigenetic or metabolic shift? And we're going to get into some biopsies of fat tissue and messenger RNA expression and changes in genes that they looked at, and some critiques of that as well. So anyway, they wanted to sort of disentangle this. And so they had individuals ramp up to the start of the study in the 4-week window leading up to the start of the 21-day study. They had subjects eat their maintenance calories, habitual dietary intake, and do diet tracking every day and so forth to figure out roughly how many calories are these people eating on a daily, what's their daily habitual energy look like and food intake. and then they figured out the calories, and then they started stratifying people and randomizing people. Again, these are healthy individuals. There was a fair amount of women in the study. I think it was a roughly 50-50 ratio of men to women. No health issues. BMI average was 24, things like that. Age, I think, was between 20 and 65 years old. So they randomized people into one of three different groups. The control group essentially was daily energy restriction. Again, so they had that 4-week window leading up to the study. And they said, hey, Sally, it looks like you're consuming about 2,200 calories per day. Let's chop 25% of those calories off every single day. And again, these are free living conditions. These individuals were not in a lab. They enrolled in a study and they went home with some parameters, and they were supposed to adhere to those, but there was not like continuous glucose monitors or other tools to really validate if people were adhering to this. But anyway, so they said, Sally, you are in group 1, which is going to be standard calorie restriction. So eat whatever you were eating, but just chop off 25% of those calories. So if you're eating, say, 2,000 calories a day, that would be shaving off 500 calories. Okay. Now, this is the fasting arm. The first fasting arm of the study was alternating between 24-hour cycles of fasting and feeding with 150% of normal energy intake when feeding. So let's pause here. Practically speaking, when anyone is prescribing alternate day fasting or intermittent fasting, no one is recommending consuming an energy surplus on your refeed days. So again, part of intermittent fasting, of course, is the autophagy and the benefits associated with that, increased ketogenesis, reduction in glucose, and so forth. Those are sort of things that people are excited about when they fast. But the energy deficit is another attribute of fasting. And so these individuals, now I understand why the researchers and the authors, Templeman et al., did this, because if at the end of 21 days, eating 150% of daily energy needs every other day versus, eating just 75% of your energy needs every day, it comes out at the end of 21 days to be in calorie balance. Both those groups are going to consume roughly the same amount of energy. So I see why they did that, because they wanted to sort of disentangle again. What are is there any added benefits to fasting compared to just calorie restriction, which we'll get into. Now, the other arm of the study, so this is group 3, they did alternate day fasting, but on their feeding days, they had 200% of their daily energy needs. Again, so no one's recommending this either. That's a lot of food. So if I normally eat 2,000 calories per day, plus or minus, that would mean I alternate day fast, and on my feed days, I have 4,000 calories. That's a lot of food, right? So, and here's another interesting aspect about only the alternate day fasting arm of the study, is they were instructed to break their fast at it was 3:00 in the afternoon. So you're doing it's more like a 30 or 32 hour fast, it seems like, for some of these individuals. Which is a lot, and that's pretty extreme. So the fact that they did lose a small amount of muscle, which was not statistically significant between the groups, which was kind of interesting. So there wasn't actually statistically significantly more muscle loss in the alternate day fasting group compared to the calorie restriction group. This is what the media talked a lot about, is you lose muscle and so forth. Now, if we look here, the p-value in terms of fat-free mass and so forth was 0.35. So there was a little bit more there was like 0.75 kilograms more muscle loss, but so we're talking about maybe a pound in 21 days, but that's a pretty big fast, even though you were in a surplus on the feed days. Again, we're talking about not having any food until 3 p.m. So to me, that's every other day. Like that's a lot, pretty interesting. So now it's important because Templeman et al. Go on, I think it's page 5 here, and they talk about, they were critical of this aspect of time-restricted feeding. And I think this is a really important point, number one, that we needed to get into, even more important than the small difference in fat loss, which favored the group that did 25% energy restriction. Okay, so they did lose, it was a p-value of 0.01. They lost a kilogram more fat. Okay, so we're talking about 2.2 pounds, okay, over the course of 21 days. So it's important to acknowledge that. So does that mean that calorie balance is the sine qua non factor here when it comes to obesity and so forth? Potentially. But let's pick apart a few of the different details. So it's important that, so they go on to say that the fact that intermittent fasting exerted no greater effect than continuous daily energy restriction on anthropometric, metabolic, and behavioral outcomes in this study, in part may be a consequence of the alternate day nature of the fasting period, specifically transition between feeding and fasting states at 1500 hours on alternate days may not be conducive to the environment of diurnal rhythms within the human circadian timing. The signal effects of high or low nutrient availability may then be compromised because metabolic and behavioral food anticipatory activity cannot be aligned to a regular meal pattern in each daylight period. It's important. So really, they were eating pretty late. Imagine eating 4,000 calories between 3 p.m. and the time you go to bed. That's going to screw up your sleep. That's going to screw up a lot, right? Or imagine, if I eat 2,000 calories a day, imagine if I have, 3,000 calories, again, between 3 and 9 p.m. or something like that. I'm probably not going to sleep that good. I wouldn't expect to have a lot of improvements in metabolic health, although I will add that there was a greater reduction in triglycerides in the ADF group that had 150% of their energy intake on alternating days compared to the calorie restriction group. Now let's continue on here because I think it's important. It may therefore be that intermittent fasting models such as alternate day fasting or the 5-2 diet. The 5-2 diet is essentially a 24-hour period of food on non-consecutive days. So this would be like a 24-hour fast on a Monday, a 24-hour fast on a Thursday. Okay, a 5-2 diet that do not repeat every 24 hours necessarily have less potential to optimize physiological function than models in which fasting is scheduled at the same time each day, such as time-restricted feeding. Now, this is important. You all know my biases. I'm a big fan of early time-restricted feeding, meaning eating, say, between 8 and 4 or 10 and 6, or, pushing. Because from a circadian rhythm standpoint, from a digestive standpoint, from gut motility, we are more primed to eat earlier in the day. Around between 11 and 2 is when your body is most receptive to digest and break down and assimilate and process the foods that you eat. Remember, these individuals were not breaking their fast until 3 p.m. I generally don't advise that for people, and most of the science supports early time-restricted feeding. When it comes to metabolic health, changes in mTOR and autophagy and so forth, we have that study from June of 2019 that looked at early time-restricted feeding compared to just a big open window, and they found some benefits. So that's, I think, important. Now, the other thing that's worth noting and talking about is they found that in the folks that did the alternate day fast, both arms of the study, whether they're having 200% of their daily energy intake on feed days or 150% of their energy intake on feed days, they found that there was a greater reduction in non-exercise associated thermogenesis. So this is just regular moving around, going out and checking the mail, moving around. So they had like activity monitors, and they found that accounted for, on average, about 150 calories a day. And this was most notable in the group, interestingly, that did the alternate day feeding group. This was group 2, again, that on their feed days, they had 150% of energy intake on feed days. So there was a reduction in activity. Now, would that account for the changes in fat loss? Potentially. And so that was, again, part of some of the headlines that you're seeing here in the media saying why intermittent fasting may not be your best diet choice. And for losing weight, calorie counting tops fasting diets. So that might be part of it, is because what they found is that, on the alternate fasting days, individuals were moving less. And so that accounted for roughly, if you want to quantify it, 150 calories per day less. Now that might sound trivial. That's basically like a kombucha or maybe a beer or a glass of wine. But you add that up over the course of days, weeks, months, and years, that can add up. Okay, so that's some important stuff. Now, it's also important to talk about the changes in gene expression that they did. They did some biopsies here in fat tissue, looking at inflammatory cytokine related genes, insulin and adiponectin and leptin related genes. They looked at PPAR, a few of these different genes, and they noted some changes, upregulation and downregulation within these genes, but it wasn't statistically significant. Now, I was able to look at the materials and methods, which you can also find for free, right here in the show notes, but on this video link as well to the full text article. There was actually 50% more data in the group that did the calorie restriction group compared to the alternate day fasting groups in terms of how many biopsies they did from the fat cell or adipocyte biopsies. Now, why is that important to understand is this was an optional part of the study where if subjects wanted to participate in a fat tissue biopsy, as part of the study, they were welcome to, but they didn't have to. Now, there's just not as much data for the groups that did the alternate day fasting group. And they go on to talk about this, actually in the article, they say the sample size was slightly reduced for adipose tissue gene expression. And I looked in the material, the raw data, and it wasn't applicable. A lot of people, for whatever reason, in the fasting arm of the study did not give, it was about 50% less samples. I don't know why or whatever, but that's just how it is. So let's go on and talk then about what the media is saying, what these media headlines are talking a lot about is the fat loss and the weight loss. And so I think that's an important element here, and I can just share with you on the screen some of the figures and some of the data and so forth. And so what we're looking at here in terms of fat mass changes and so forth, fat mass grams. So they were able to quantify this, I believe, MRI. I'm not sure, but you see these p-values of 0.01. So fat mass changes, you're talking about basically a kilogram and 1 3/4 kilogram was the change before and after in the calorie restriction group compared to just 3/4 kilogram. So again, fat mass changes over the course of 21 days. It does favor continuous energy restriction at 25% calorie deficit throughout every single day. Now, and then you look here at fat-free mass, which is right here. So it looks like, wow, if you do intermittent fasting, you're going to lose a lot more muscle. We're talking about 0.75 kilograms compared to a very nominal change in the energy restriction group. Now, again, because these subjects were lean, they weren't obese and so forth, you would expect to see more muscle loss in the group that did a full 30-hour fast every other day. I would expect that, even though energy balance would be sort of on par. That's a lot of fasting. Now, what was interesting here, now since you're all looking at this, or if you're listening in iTunes, you can come over here and check this out. Visceral fat mass. This was interesting. There was more visceral fat mass lost. Again, we're talking about 3 grams, not major, right? There was quantitatively more visceral fat mass lost. In the group that did alternate day fasting and ate 150% of daily energy requirements on feed days compared to the group that just did a 25% calorie restriction. So that's kind of interesting to me. And then what was also interesting to me is there was really not much difference in terms of insulin and so forth, non-statistical intergroup differences and so on. But the triglycerides, this was interesting, is there was a greater reduction in triglycerides in the group. And again, right here, here's the groups. You have the alternate day fasting with 150% energy daily intake on feed days compared to the group that did 25% energy restriction. And if you look here, there was a fairly significant difference in reduction in triglycerides. Now that is interesting because obviously, if you look at, and many of you may not know this, I say obviously, but triglycerides is a very responsive marker to improvements in metabolic health. Now, you wouldn't expect to see massive improvements in just 3 weeks, but post-meal triglycerides being lower in the folks that did alternate day fasting compared to calorie restriction. Now, what could be interesting about that is the alternate day fasting group was doing a certain element of time restricted feeding because again, they were eating at just 3. They started to break their fast at 3 p.m., which again, far too late in my estimation to break your fast. I would like to have maybe seen a window of maybe 10 to 4 or something like that, or 10 to 6, not starting at 3. But anyway, I thought that was kind of interesting. Now, the changes here in leptin, some of the media are talking about this. You get a greater leptin reduction with calorie counting. So we're talking about a minus 3.8 versus minus 2.8. So Nothing really to brag home about, not super significant, but it's just, kind of important to recognize that. So I would have expected, considering that there was a kilogram extra fat loss in the group that did continuous energy restriction, I would have thought leptin changes would have been more. There would have been more changes in leptin. So anyway, that's what's going on here. Now, there is some other images here in the fat tissue biopsy gene expression. You may want to, I thought this was kind of interesting. So they looked at circadian clock genes, adipocytokines, insulin sensitivity, autophagy, and so forth. But again, there was simply more data collected, more tissue biopsies in the calorie restriction group. So friends, there's a lot more sometimes to these studies than what the media highlights. Again, you can see the media highlights here. It's just, they're saying fasting, no magic bullet. Fasting, not that great. There's some nuances here. Practically speaking, no one recommending fasting is having people or suggesting people consume an excess calories on their feed days. And also, we need to keep in mind the circadian clock system. Starting to, breaking your fast at 3 p.m., probably a little late. Definitely a little late, I would say. So anyway, friends, I'm grateful that you tuned all the way in. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, you can hit that like button. You can share this. My Instagram handle is metabolic_Mike. If you like these science-based videos and things like that, be sure to support our sister company, Myoscience Nutrition, tools to help optimize and support whole body health. We have a new vitamin D and also zinc chewable that are just phenomenal. You can check those out over at myoscience.com, MYOXCIENCE.com. Check out the new chewables. They are really phenomenal. It's a nice little treat, and you can get some micronutrients, 1,000 international units of vitamin D and 12 milligrams of zinc in those different chewables. So I'm going to sign off. As always, I'm grateful that you were here. Have an awesome rest of your day. Thanks for tuning in. We'll catch you all soon. Bye now.